D. The enduring unconscious. You'll recall that we come into being through the completely unconscious action of the idea, i.e., the original divine spark in us, like a crystal unconsciously growing according to the idea of its geometric shape. In this way, we develop and remain in being. I shall now examine further the power the unconscious has and maintains in us, aside from that which it exerts through the conscious mind. First of all, the unconscious in our souls acts in more than one way. This has already been pointed out partly above, but now, looking back from the pinnacle of the unconscious mind and summing up all the forms of unconscious activity of the inborn divine spark, we must set up certain categories to aid scientific understanding. We must admit that there is a region of the life of the soul which is inaccessible to the light of consciousness. This is the absolute unconscious. This absolute unconscious can spread over the whole reign of the idea within us. In that case, it is general. So it was during embryonic existence, when the reign of the idea was occupied with development alone. At a later stage, absolute unconsciousness no longer characterizes the whole life of the soul. Consciousness is somehow developed. Here, idea really has become soul. But all the forming, destroying, and life-recreating processes still remain completely outside consciousness. The unconscious is now no longer general, but only partial. Furthermore, besides the absolute unconscious, general or partial, there is a relative unconscious, i.e., that region of the conscious life of the soul which may for a time become unconscious, but returns to consciousness again and again. This is the largest area of the mind's world in the fully mature soul, for we comprehend and keep before us only a small portion of our entire conceptual world at any given moment. What can we say about the relationship between the absolute unconscious and the relative unconscious? The veil of Isis hangs before the absolute general unconscious of the soul during the embryonic formative period. In that stage, the idea of the divine basic concept of a whole human existence, mysterious and secluded within itself, unfolds the entire structure of the organism, according to which the conscious mind later functions and develops. Consciousness can never really lift the veil. Yet, analogy and comparison can demonstrate that one and the same intelligence reigns in both areas of the soul. In the unconscious, it is truly unconscious thinking. The conscious mind grasps the partial unconscious more easily. The light of consciousness shines, in a manner to be discussed later, and illuminates this area within us. Light makes us aware of the darkness of the night. The partial absolute unconscious acts for the general absolute unconscious, governing all development, growth, nutrition, blood circulation, breathing, and secretion. The region of the conscious life of the soul develops completely within the nervous system and the senses. The partial unconscious is an aspect of that same soul, which appears as consciousness in other regions. Since it really is part of the same soul, all its activity must somehow be reflected through all of the regions of the soul, and thus also in consciousness. The emotional world of the mind can be understood mainly in these reflections from the partial unconscious. This is why an upset digestion interferes with the conceptual life, and a change in the blood will also influence the mood of the mind. A strong reminder from those dark regions to the bright regions of consciousness asserts itself all too decisively. In the past, due to vague concepts of the whole organism, these effects of the unconscious were erroneously considered evidence of connections between the physical and the spiritual. Now, however, it is easy to see in that Such relationships and intercourse between certain regions of the unconscious and conscious life of the soul. These are but different aspects of the same divine unity. The close connection of the partial unconscious to pure consciousness, to the mature mind, can perhaps be clarified by the following analogy. The fully conscious aspect of the soul is the shining spire of a Gothic cathedral, attracting the eye by its wealth of ornament, a spire reaching to the skies. But it could not shine in its beauty or attain such heights if the foundations, resting deep in the earth, and a firm structure of walls and iron did not support it. All the finest qualities of the conscious life of the soul depend in countless ways on the unconscious soul. The cathedral spire will collapse if a single iron clamp breaks or the cornerstone gives way. The most splendid products of the mind will also vanish if the smallest obstacle obstructs the unconscious activity of the soul, governing the blood flow to the heart or regulating the phases of breathing. These considerations are usually neglected. If they are entertained at all, regret is expressed that the mind depends on the body. However, to the eye that can see things in their totality, it appears as a beautiful and necessary indication of the common basis shared by consciousness and the unconscious spheres of the soul in one and the same divine idea. If those wonderful and mysterious processes of the unconscious world of the soul are understood by the conscious mind, if it sees itself supported by the unconscious like a rainbow floating lightly over a dark wall of rain clouds, then the basis of essential understanding is at hand. Further study of the subject will then yield more significant results. If one attempts to penetrate carefully and deeply into the origin of the life of our souls, one is inevitably brought back to the fundamental point that in the embryonic state the soul reigns unconsciously. All higher mental dispositions are potentially present, and the structure of the nerves in the brain are unfolded in this unconscious state. Eventually one will also understand where this unconscious thinking process, which is responsible for the structure and transformation of the organism, becomes translated into consciousness. Schelling put it quite beautifully. All motion and activity, all vital impulse, even that of nature, is only an unconscious process of thought, or happens in the form of the latter. The more in nature what is normal or conformable to law becomes apparent. By so much more, the more spiritual do her workings appear. Optical phenomena are but a system of geometry, the lines of which are traced by the light, and the perfected theory of nature would be that by virtue of which the whole of nature should resolve itself into an intelligence. After seeing the world as an aspect and revelation of the divine, who would not be deeply convinced of the necessity for an inner intelligence in all natural life? It should be made perfectly clear that much of the partially self-conscious soul remains in the night of the unconscious. If we examine the characteristics of formative life, of the continual building and destroying activity of the unconscious, and compare them with consciousness, some other basic elements in the distinction between consciousness and the unconscious will clearly appear. We soon become convinced of two facts: the dominance of sheer necessity through the realm of the unconscious, and the freedom which comes with the awakening of consciousness. The opposites, those most significant factors for all further understanding of the life of the soul, date from this stage of emerging consciousness. Whatever forms unconsciously within us in the beginning is a living manifestation of the divine. The destiny of this divine manifestation lies outside the control of the individual existence, just as the individual mind can never fully fathom it. No individual will can exist in that region, because will presupposes understanding. But a necessity, foreign to our understanding and to our will, is unconditionally existent. Being the sole determining force for the largely unconscious soul, it also influences the freedom of the part of the soul that has become conscious. Thus, because our whole psychic existence hovers forever between unconsciousness and consciousness. We constantly waver throughout life between free will and compulsion, freedom and necessity. Anyone who has ever tried to explain how the split between necessity and freedom works throughout the universe will see how important such an explanation is for psychology. Man, seemingly so weak and insignificant beside the planets and the thundering elements, achieves importance and position because he possesses freedom through consciousness. The non-human universe simply obeys a mute law of necessity. Nevertheless, we can raise freedom above the realm of necessity only conditionally. The conscious, undetermined by necessity, because it is by nature divine, has a certainty, a wisdom, and a beauty that consciousness and freedom never possess, ever at their greatest heights. Conscious thinking wavers, takes 2 steps forward and slips 1 behind. Then it strives to do right. The unconscious reign of the idea, however, goes its precise way with conviction and deep unconscious wisdom, forming its being with a beauty whose fullness conscious life can never comprehend, let alone imitate. When consciousness and freedom regain their awe of the unconscious and of necessity, it will be possible to draw vital conclusions from these observations. As has already been pointed out, knowledge penetrating from consciousness into the unconscious reaches its highest aim, just as ability only becomes highest art if it can be made unconscious again. The interested psychologist must therefore visualize the complex way in which the idea of our being is forever active in the realm of the unconscious, developing and modifying our organism. The further into the details of this unconscious world he goes, the more vitally significant will be the results attained. He will observe that the essence of the soul, eternal in itself, is more active in the unconscious than in consciousness. It is never interrupted, but is active throughout life. Consciousness cannot do this. It needs a periodic return into the unconscious, a return we call sleep. This leads to an observation altogether neglected and unappreciated. In the entire realm of the unconscious life of the soul, fatigue does not exist. Liquid currents thus flow restlessly within us. The heart beats, the lungs breathe, and the glands secrete incessantly. In all these manifestations of life, there is no pause or fatigue. This is all the more remarkable when we consider how quickly other muscles tire after long activity. All conscious processes require constant interruption and refreshment. We also find that many notions borrowed from the conscious life of the soul cannot be applied to the unconscious, e.g., the concepts of gradual learning, practice, accomplishment. Vital functions in the realm of the unconscious need no tedious study, no practice to achieve dexterity. All is done and achieved easily and immediately, as required by the nature of a particular being. The crystal grows in a certain way because it must. Similarly, the higher organism needs no special preparation for its unconscious life processes. It executes them quite simply because they are part of its life. I have said earlier that consciousness differs from the unconscious, as freedom differs from determinism. This, of course, refers to the deeds and activities of mature life. But we must also remember, as the history of the development of the organism has taught us, that necessity and compulsion determine each individual's traits and uniqueness, and that each soul can only develop as itself. These 2 determining factors stem exclusively from the realm of the unconscious. Perhaps Goethe thought of this as the demon within us when he said, "According to the law you entered into, so you must be. You cannot escape from yourself, and no time and no power fragments moulded form that livingly evolves." The conscious life of the soul develops slowly from the total unconsciousness of the idea. A feeling of self, and finally a consciousness of self, develops from progressively obscure sentience, just as remembrance does from memorance, and free action from determined activity. Also, all individual emotions of the conscious soul take on a certain permanent cast and are characteristically influenced by the unconscious. It is what we usually call the innate disposition of the soul, those features that are in exact and direct relation to the physical organisation. We must recognise that in the soul, consciousness is accompanied by the absolute unconscious form from which it has developed. There is also the relative and secondary unconsciousness, into which consciousness periodically returns. All those feelings and cognitions that had once reached consciousness and then returned to slumber unconsciously in the soul continuously influence the consciousness, the conscious life of the soul, and the absolute unconsciousness. The ordered and beautiful are beneficial and furthering. The base and ugly are obstructing and hindering. This secondary and periodic unconscious is thoroughly united with the primary and absolute unconscious in the life of the soul. Since the absolute unconscious conditions the development and modification of the organism, the formerly conscious feelings of the soul, which have returned to the unconscious, must strongly and continuously influence the nourishment and further development of the organism. For example, let us say that an educated man has attained a pure vision of truth and beauty. His soul's absolute unconscious activity has built, has already endowed, and continues to sustain a happy organism. The soul has a wealth of concepts, feelings, and thoughts, few of which are present together in his consciousness at any given moment. And yet all these forgotten treasures are never lost. This inner wealth continually acts on every conscious feeling of the soul. Each new feeling must be beautiful and true, for the fullness of his relative unconscious life has long had this character. The relative unconsciousness also influences that part of the absolute unconscious which governs the organism's structure and modification. The man's appearance changes, his features gain clarity and noble expression. The glimmer of this ennobling influence spreads throughout the entire organism. Now let us take the opposite, a base individual, interested in the lowest things in life, who has developed into an even more uncouth being owing to his primitive absolute unconscious, a person common and ugly in all his ideas and thoughts. He too is conscious of only a few concepts at any given moment, but the repulsive, almost animal character of the entire relative unconscious life of his soul will continuously drag down every expression of the conscious soul. It will stamp them with a common, unworthy character and communicate itself to the absolute unconscious. Communicate in only a figurative sense, since both are one in essence. He will impart to his originally less fortunate organism an even more uncouth, unrefined expression. His features will become more and more those of an animal. The most solid structures, like the skeleton, will be affected. Anyone who carefully considers these observations will be convinced that only the study of the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, as they are united in the soul, reveals a deeper understanding of the entire life of the soul. Many incomprehensible facts are thus made clear and quite understandable. In particular, we can see now how concepts, i.e. impulses of the conscious soul, can influence formative processes through modifications of the unconscious life of the soul. Moreover, formative relationships always influence concepts. It is a well-known fact that not only the sensation, but even the thought of familiar liquids, lemon juice for example, can increase salivation. An object of anger almost immediately increases a strong bilious secretion. This can make other milder secretions, for example the milk of nursing mothers, bitter and even poisonous. In both cases the secretion change is quite unconscious, but in the end it always comes from the conscious and unconscious life of the soul, which is essentially one. The cause of the modification in the unconscious is precisely the same as the subject of that concept in consciousness. The bilious secretion and the formation of poison in the unconscious are the equal of anger in consciousness. When the feeling of anger arises, it calls forth the mechanisms of that secretion in the unconscious. The process can also begin in the unconscious and then appear transfigured into relative concepts in consciousness. For instance, a sleeper's breathing process is hindered by carbon fumes. Immediately, images of monsters rise in his dreaming consciousness, pressing on his chest and stifling him. Medicines like opium and henbane, which affect the conscious sphere of the life of the soul, are usually thought of as being exclusively psychic. They modify the unconscious in the same way that certain conscious psychical states can also modify it. The drug primarily affects the unconscious and secondarily causes changes in consciousness by polarization. For instance, thicker blood, more carbonated and poorly oxygenated due to innervation, reduces the brain's activity, and this results in sleep. An oppressed mental state, or the habit of sleeping too much, creates the same state in the blood. Now, if opium and henbane in large doses cause a higher level of blood carbonation, they will benumb the mind. We have recognized necessity and immediacy and intrinsic qualities of the original unconscious. Another essential and most important attribute of the soul's unconscious activity is generalization, i.e., the especially close connection of the unconscious with the non-individual general world. Or to put it another way, this is the quality of being embodied in the general. The perceptive mind is soon convinced of the world's inner organic connection. Each organism, although it appears for a time as an individual entity, is really but a part, an organ, an organism subsidiary to a higher unity. Yet when this perceptive self-conscious mind awakens, it causes a feeling of individuality, of being unique. Therefore, a certain separation from the world as a whole is felt. This opposition between the ego and the outside world, like that between necessity and freedom, comes into prominence at that moment. The unconscious, however, does not contain this play of opposites, though it restlessly endeavours to sustain a certain autonomy for its own organism, in order for the perceptive mind to develop to the peak of its existence. In the unconscious, the general existence of the world continues to flow without interruption. All the threads linking the individual to the whole remain unbroken in the unconscious. It is very important for psychology to keep this in mind while observing the organism. The more unself-conscious an organism is, the less it is an individual. Its unconscious implications in the general world will be more direct. It is more dependent on the general organism's way of life. It senses, remembers and foresees all life processes of the general organism on a far more unconscious level. This fact illuminates many things in the history of familiar lower organisms. We can understand why protozoa, plants and lower animals are so completely subject to changes in telluric life, and why their inner structure, unconsciously foreseeing future needs, always develops according to the conditions of their sphere of life. For example, they seem to know in advance, and show that they do in their structure, about atmospheric changes. We, of course, are completely unaware of such events, but we use this same fact to evaluate accurately the psychic processes of our own organism. Our own psyche remains at the unconscious level totally in the beginning, and to a great degree later on. Because it is unconscious, it senses its own life status, and in turn unconsciously determines the development of the organism through memorance and presentiment. Moreover, as part idea, first of humanity and then of the universe, our psyche must be unconsciously permeated by all the stirrings in the soul of mankind and in the souls of the universe. This permeation may only manifest itself in the most distant contexts, but it must truly and really exist. The attraction between physical masses pervades the world in like manner, more noticeably at certain times than at others. To make this clear, consider the following. It is a definite fact that mutual gravitation or attraction exists between two planets. Every free-floating mass attracts every other in relation to its mass, and is in turn attracted. Thus, a falling stone is powerfully attracted by the much larger Earth, but it also attracts the Earth. We do not notice this later attraction because it is infinitely small, nor can we feel the vibration over the whole Tellurian mass caused by an artificial explosion. The English mathematician Charles Babbage has made very interesting calculations on these vibrations. Similarly, we must realize that our unconscious life is affected by all humanity, by the life of the earth, and by the universe, for it is definitely an integral part of this totality. The number of ways the unconscious is affected is infinite. The movement of the planets, other than the sun and the moon, affects our inner sentience, but to such a small degree that we may compare it to the earth's attraction to a falling stone. The distant masses of mankind remain just as foreign to our inner sentience. Changes in the atmosphere and in our planet's electric and magnetic currents, however, affect our unconscious life as deeply as do changes in the lives of human beings who are much closer to us. Indeed, the correlations in the sphere are most essential. At first, they are all unconscious, although, under certain conditions, there may be communication from this dark realm to consciousness. Presentiment in dreams, empathy with events on the earth and in the heavens or in the fate of men, the astonishing magnetic rapport between distant persons, and other riddles whose solution normal psychology cannot provide, may be fully explained only by these observations. The relation of a human embryo to the life of its mother offers most remarkable features. Since consciousness has not even dawned in the embryo, the absolute and general unconscious still reigns throughout. Thus its relation to the surrounding life sphere of the mother is most intimate. The mother's life unconsciously permeates this developing individual. This is sufficient to explain the occasionally irrefutable effects of a fright during pregnancy, an occurrence that demonstrates, more than anything else, how delicate the link between two lives may be. Frequently, we can consciously perceive that a strong feeling of the soul directed to a definite part of the body instantly and involuntarily causes sensation in that place, or even a change of function. For example, the definite feeling when imagining how painful a knife in the eye would be, or the mouth watering when imagining a cut lemon. A pregnant woman's vivid imagination of some injury or deformity cannot influence her life at all, since she has been freed by the development of consciousness. It can, however, very definitely affect the child's still unconscious life that is closely linked to the mother's, even to the extent of causing a similar deformity. The reason obviously lies in the greater delicacy and mobility of the child's formative life, and in the fact that the unconscious in the embryo is still absolute and total. Thus the English proverb, "The education of the child begins 9 months before birth," is quite right. The embryo is forced to be part of everything that affects its mother due to the greater unconsciousness and closer union with a higher entity. After birth, man shares less in the happenings taking place around him. Of course, application of this law to the psychic life of the animal kingdom is important. The conscious human life of the soul is affected in yet another way. We have said earlier that everything belonging in the conscious life of the soul does not always remain in consciousness, but returns periodically into the unconscious. The above law of the absolute unconscious also applies to whatever becomes periodically unconscious. While it is unconscious, the previously conscious content must come into closer rapport with the general than it was before, and suffer a certain degree of change. This is immensely important for many processes in the life of the soul. Everybody has had the experience of finding a long dormant impression or concept being changed in some way, or being unlike its former self after its recall or involuntary return to consciousness. In some cases, the concept may be more powerful, may have grown in beauty, greatness, and variety of connotation. In others, it may have regressed, lost in beauty, fullness, and power. The concept has been influenced by the individual's own character and by the more intimate rapport of the unconscious life of the soul with the external world. The more noble and lofty the basic idea of his being, and the finer and more varied his rapport with the macrocosm, the more certainly the concept or thought will grow while in the unconscious. The lesser the idea, and the weaker the general rapport, the more likely the individual will regress. Many artists, poets, and thinkers have said that if the idea behind a significant work is retained within the soul for a long time, the work benefits. Any premature attempt to bring this idea into a work of art or of science might hinder its being perfected within. Frequent, conscious effort naturally and genuinely adds to the work, but the unconscious growth of the concept with the soul is a more important factor. A return into the unconscious furthers and strengthens individual concepts, thoughts, and sequences of thoughts. The ancient myth of Antiochus, the son of the earth who gained new strength in every contact with his mother, is repeated in the relationship between every man and his unconscious. This is especially borne out by the regeneration of the unconscious soul in sleep. Sleep is a regular return into the unconscious. Sleeping on it, for even a short period, has often clarified an obscure thought or revealed a missing connotation. Some memories, long since faded, often awaken clearly and poignantly within the soul after consciousness sinks for a short period into the unconscious. This happens because there is in the unconscious a greater generalization of life, and therefore everything that is immersed in the unconscious somehow shares in this generalization. The rapport of consciousness with the external cosmos increases when it descends into the unconscious, as does its energy and productivity. There are very important reasons for this. The unconscious is the primordial source of life. Its life is also most intimately merged with the life of the universe. Most importantly, the concept of fatigue does not exist in the unconscious. Thus, the weariness and fatigue that pervades conscious life after a long period of activity must necessarily be reduced when the soul temporarily abandons consciousness to return to the realm of the unconscious. All activity, once more, gains originality. It re-enters that sphere of psychic life where there is no learning, practicing, or forgetting. There, everything happens of its own inner accord. When an individual tries to rise out of the so-called generalization, he becomes tired and worn out in the attempt. But by giving up his individuality to the unconscious, his fatigue and weariness are partly, or even completely done away with. Nothing so restores after strenuous mental activity. Nothing so diminishes weariness of the conscious soul as does sleep. Our conscious soul is constantly strengthened by regular nightly sleep. Furthermore, the overpowering of consciousness by the unconscious in ecstasy, or being beside oneself, can, within limits, actually enliven and strengthen us. After great excitement in conscious life, fainting, i.e., complete abandonment of consciousness for a brief period, best calms the exhausted body and soul, enabling them to renew their efforts. Doctors have long been aware of the medical importance of fainting. An explanation of the process was lacking, however, and may have found a definitive explanation here.